Number 1.
Decades before a Florida man was charged with mailing explosive devices to 13 critics of President Trump, 3 members of New York City's bomb squad went to see a psychiatrist. They weren't patients, but they were desperate. It was 1956, and for 16 years, a man dubbed the Mad Bomber had been detonating pipe bombs around the city, in movie theaters, Grand Central Terminal, the New York Public Library. More than a dozen people were severely injured. Investigators were stumped. The entire country was shaken. The nearly 3 dozen homemade explosives he set off in public places brought into being a culture of fear more than 4 decades before terrorism became an American fixation. Historian Michael Cannell wrote in Incendiary, a book about the attacks. He was like a dream distortion of post-war disquiet, unhinged, unrelenting, perpetually hidden in the city shadows. Without any place to really look, the detectives went to see the shrink, an unheard-of investigatory tactic back then, but now known as criminal profiling. If physical evidence could not lead the police to the bomber, Cannell wrote, maybe emotional insights could. And so, at the desk of James A. Russell, the Deputy Commissioner of the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene, Captain Howard Finney laid out what little evidence investigators had to go on. Photographs of bombs that didn't detonate. Crime scene reports, and most important, letters the bomber had sent to newspapers, signed as FP, that railed against the world, but mostly the electric company Con Ed. Russell studied the evidence for more than 2 hours. Then he stood up to look out a window. For a long moment, Dr. Russell looked as if he had slipped into a trance, Cannell wrote, as if he were straining to hear a signal in the white noise of the city, a psychic tap-tap-tap that would lead him to the bomber. The investigators waited. Then, as Cannell described it, he turned to Captain Finney and described his fugitive, right down to the cut of his jacket. He was right. The bomber, Russell said, was a paranoid schizophrenic and probably believed someone and some entity was controlling or plotting against him. He probably had a lot of workplace grudges. The bomber was not fat or skinny, he was symmetrically built. Finney was skeptical. Russell cited studies showing 17 of 20 paranoids had athletic builds. The handwriting in his letters was perfect, Russell said, so he was a perfectionist and probably a very good employee wherever he worked. Also, he was neatly groomed and cared about his appearance. Then Russell went even deeper. In his letters, the Mad Bomber used a stilted tone and words such as treachery or dastardly deeds, words not really colloquial at the time. He's a Slav, Russell concluded. Mind giving the reasoning behind that? The captain asked. Russell's answer, bombs and knives were tools of Middle Europe. The bomber, of course, used bombs. But he also used knives to cut holes into places where he planted his devices. When one man uses both, that suggests he could be Slav, Russell explained. There was a sexual frustration component to Russell's analysis that boiled down to the Mad Bomber's probably being unmarried with little to no romance in his life. And because Slavs prized family ties, he most likely lived with someone not unlike his mother. Oh, and something else, the letters were mailed from Westchester County, about halfway between New York and Connecticut, where many Slavs lived. So the Mad Bomber probably lived in Connecticut and mailed his letters from Westchester as a cover. But the shrink wasn't finished, Cannell wrote. When you catch him, Russell said, and I have no doubt you will, he'll be wearing a double-breasted suit. Button 2. The investigators left. In a matter of weeks, they acted on a key piece of advice from Russell, leak the doctor's psychological hunches. This might draw out the Mad Bomber, who probably yearned for acknowledgement. After the New York Times printed some of Russell's theories, the New York Journal-American, feeling scooped, decided to up the ante by printing an open letter to the bomber imploring him to give himself up. Incredibly, the Mad Bomber wrote back, over and over, each time revealing more details about himself. He was injured at Con Ed, it turned out. He had filed claims that went nowhere. At one point, he even revealed the date of his injury, September 5, 1931.
Number 2.
Since the 1970s, there have been several ghastly attacks on campers. Here are some of the most shocking stories from the USA and the United Kingdom. Although you are highly unlikely to ever encounter a murderer stalking your campsite, these cases are certainly food for thought. In June 1977, 3 young Girl Scouts went off to summer camp for 2 weeks at Camp Scott, Mays County, in the Ozark Hills of Oklahoma. Lori Lee Farmer, 8, Michelle Heather Goose, 9, and Doris Denise Milner, 10, were brutally sexually assaulted and murdered in their tent number 8 in the Kiowa Sub Camp under the nose of camp counselors. Jean Leroy Hart was eventually tried for the killings, but acquitted with allegations of both a botched investigation and a rigged jury. Who was responsible for these infamous and terrible murders in the beautiful forest around Camp Scott? Was it really Hart, or did the authorities miss crucial leads which might have led to another suspect? In the summer of 1973, the Yeager family from Farmington, Michigan set off on a month-long road trip out west. On June 25, 1973, Susan Susie Yeager was camping at the Missouri Headwaters State Park near Three Forks with her family when an intruder cut open the tent and kidnapped her in the middle of the night. On September 17, 1974, a bone from a female child was found at an unoccupied remote ranch northeast of Three Forks. The kidnapper turned out to be David Meirhofer, who was arrested on September 27, 1974 by the Gallatin County, Montana Sheriff's Office. Sophie Louise Hook was murdered at the age of 7 years in Llandudno, Wales in the early hours of July 30, 1995. She was from Great Budworth, near Northwich, Cheshire, but was staying at the home of her uncle, Danny Jones, at the Welsh seaside resort when she was snatched. She had gone missing from a tent where she was camping in her uncle's garden, and her body was found washed up on a nearby beach several hours later. A local man called Howard Hughes was arrested for the murder soon afterward and sentenced to life imprisonment after being found guilty in July 1996. Following his trial, it was revealed that Hughes had been linked to multiple sex attacks against children, but police had been unable to prosecute either because of a lack of evidence or because the victims' parents had wanted to spare their children further ordeal in court. He himself had a troubled background, including allegations of abuse at the Brynneston Children's Home in Wrexham during the 1980s, the site of a major pedophile ring. The story is a shocking tale of childhood innocence snatched by an evil pedophile obsessed with kidnapping and having sex with young girls. A man who was unable to resist his perversions and took Sophie's life in the most horrible of circumstances, and where even the coroner said it looked like she had been involved in a car accident given the seriousness of her injuries, many of which occurred whilst she was still alive and fighting for life. During the attack, she had been in so much pain that she left teeth marks on both sides of her tongue and inside her lower lip. For the Hook and Jones family, a birthday party turned sour and a night that they would never have even thought of in their darkest hour. Julie Hook, Sophie's mother, said, "I protected my children so much. They were not allowed to cross the road on their own. We both feel very, very sorry that the one time she needed us most we were simply not there for her. That feeling will never go away." On August 2, 1982, Bob Johnson, 44, and Jackie Johnson, 41, and their daughters Janet, 13, and Karen, 11, went on a 2-week camping trip with Jackie's parents, George Bentley, 66, and Edith Bentley, 59. Sadly, it was the last family vacation they were ever to go on. The Johnsons and Bentleys were last heard from on August 6, 1982. Their time near the beautiful Wells Gray Park was cut short by a sadistic, brutal killer obsessed with young girls called David William Shearing. A sad and depressing story of outdoor adventure gone wrong, bad luck, and a mission by 2 Royal Canadian Mounted Police detectives to find the perpetrator of these awful crimes. The media referred to the tragedy as the Wells Gray Park murders, but the actual site of the family's massacre was just outside the park entrance.
Number 3.
During the early 1980s, the Secret Service had been investigating a new counterfeit operation and had began handing out sketches of the suspect to various stores. By chance, they had just left one when the clerk recognized a man trying to pass off a fake bill. After a foot chase, he was apprehended, and a search of his car revealed some items that made them think he was involved in some more serious crimes. In the trunk were thousands in fake money, a stash of pornography, various drugs, stolen license plates, fake driver's licenses, a forged police badge, police lights, and various items he'd bought with the counterfeit cash. Further investigation led them through various false names to an apartment. However, this proved to be a disappointment with nothing related to his illegal activities found. What was found was the address of a storage facility, and there the manager said he was expecting law enforcement after some of the things he'd seen in the lockup when the door was left open by accident. Inside they found more cash, handcuffs, another police badge, the names and addresses of several women, and various sexual and kidnap-type items. These included a cocker chain, dildo, Kentucky jelly, shoelaces, and most disturbingly a torture audio tape. The tape featured a woman being tortured and begging to die, and this made agents look further into the case. They soon identified the man as James Mitchell DeBardeleben II, who had previous records for fraud, sodomy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. A profile was developed of a man who was a forger, rapist, possible serial killer, and sadistic sexually. Some of the crimes they traced to him included various rapes where he abducted the women and held them captive whilst he raped and sodomized them before releasing them in the middle of nowhere. They also found he murdered at least one woman, hanging her up with a belt and stabbing her twice. They also worked out he'd usually impersonated a police officer and used this to lure his victims. His numerous ex-wives also came forward and told agents that he'd often fantasized about performing various violent sexual acts and tortures. It turned out the recording that sparked the more serious investigation was that of his fourth wife, with whom he was acting out a torture script he'd written. DeBardeleben was convicted of various counts of kidnapping, rape, and fraud, but never murder. He was sentenced to over 300 years in prison, and this long sentence meant several states dropped charges they were intending on pursuing against him. He never admitted any of his crimes, and died in prison in 2011 aged 74. The true extent of his criminal activity will never be known, but investigators suspect he could have killed many more women in sadistic fashion. DeBardeleben's first confirmed sex offense came in 1966 when he was arrested for kidnapping and sodomy on a young girl, a crime which he carried out with Wanda Davis's cousin. However, the charges were dropped when the jury learned that the victim had gotten into the car with the two men willingly. Davis became pregnant with DeBardeleben's child twice. The first was miscarried when he pushed her down a flight of stairs in a fit of rage. When she gave birth to his daughter, Lindsay, they had already divorced, and he had moved on to another vulnerable young woman. His fourth wife, Karen, was 12 years younger than him when they married. At the time he began to woo her, she was 17 and still in high school. Like Wanda Faye, Karen was also subjected to the same degrading treatment. Like Davis, she too was groomed as accomplice to numerous scams and criminal activities. In 1976, DeBardeleben was arrested for counterfeiting for the first time. It was during the search of his home, investigators with the Secret Service located his printing press, as well as a collection of dildos, whips, vibrators, and a stack of 5x7 cards with the names, addresses, measurements, and physical characteristics of numerous women. The walls of his home were covered with amateur pornography. It is uncertain whether or not the women photographed were consenting partners. Evidence found during the search of DeBardeleben's home led to him being convicted of counterfeiting and sentenced to the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. While there, DeBardeleben's IQ was determined to be approximately 127, putting him in the top 4% of the population. During his imprisonment, DeBardeleben wrote, "I feel that I have been unjustly tormented, degraded, and shit upon by society, specifically the American justice system, which is rotten to the core. In order to regain an adequate self-image, I feel compelled to somehow restore my self-respect. If I were to shit upon society for an adequate monetary gain, commensurate with the pan I have suffered and not get caught, it would accomplish my objective." In 1978, after spending some time at a halfway house, DeBardeleben moved to Arlington, Virginia, where he got a job as a barber. He didn't last long as a barber and took off in a newly purchased 77 Thunderbird to resume his activity of passing out counterfeits and committing rape. At the same time, an unlikely mix-up at the Crime Information Center led authorities to conclude that DeBardeleben was dead. He was then free to exact retribution against the society which he believed had unfairly treated him without the authorities inquiring about his whereabouts. That September, he abducted a 19-year-old nursing student, Lucy Alexander, raping her repeatedly. She was released the next day in Delaware. In the summer of 1979, he met his last wife, Barbara Abbott, who left him after a year and a half. At this time, DeBardeleben was heavily engaged in counterfeiting money. Because he used a lot of it at suburban malls, using fake $20 bills to buy cheap items, and getting real change back, the Secret Service nicknamed him the Mall Passer. The fake bills were used in several states, including Ohio, Virginia, Texas, Oklahoma, and Milwaukee. In 1980, he pulled over a woman while posing as a cop, intending to abduct and rape her, but she fought back and escaped. On May 25, 1983, DeBardeleben was arrested for counterfeiting. When the Secret Service searched a storage facility rented in his name looking for his printing press, they found evidence for several violent crimes they had no idea DeBardeleben was responsible for, such as handcuffs, dildos, bloody panties, lubricant, and hundreds of photos of women, most of them sexually explicit, and several audio recordings of women being tortured. In 1988, he was sentenced to 375 years in prison for his counterfeiting. The authorities felt they could not get convictions on the sex crimes because of a lack of evidence. He was confined in maximum security for his entire prison sentence. DeBardeleben was also a prime suspect for two murders, that of a realtor in 1982 and that of one of two men he held for ransom in 1983, but wasn't convicted of them. He remained in prison until his death from pneumonia in 2011, aged 70.
Number 4.
Between 1978 and 2001, at least 65 women disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side. Robert Pickton, who operated a pig farm in nearby Port Coquitlam, was charged with murdering 26 of the women. He was convicted on 6 charges and sentenced to life in prison. In a jail cell conversation with an undercover police officer, Pickton claimed to have murdered 49 women. The murders led to the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history, and Pickton's farm became the largest crime scene in Canadian history. The case became a flashpoint in the wider issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. In 2012, a provincial government inquiry into the case concluded that blatant failures by police, including inept criminal investigative work, compounded by police and societal prejudice against sex trade workers and Indigenous women, led to a tragedy of epic proportions. Robert William Willie Pickton, born 1949, was raised on a family-operated pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Pickton and his siblings sold most of the property for urban development, reducing the farm to 6.5 hectares. Pickton maintained a small-scale livestock operation at the farm. He also received a share of the proceeds from the real estate transactions and was a partner with his brother, David, in a salvage company. Pickton was a socially awkward man who was known to have exhibited strange behaviors. He lived alone in a trailer home on the farm. In 1996, the Pickton brothers started the Piggy's Palace Good Times Society. It was a federally registered charity with an alleged mandate to raise funds for service organizations through events such as dances and shows. Neighbors complained of rowdiness, drug use, drunkenness, and noise. The parties were attended by as many as 1,700 people, including bikers and sex trade workers from the downtown east side. In 2000, the city of Port Coquitlam shut Piggy's Palace down. Vancouver's downtown east side neighborhood is known for its high rates of poverty, homelessness, open drug use, and prostitution. In the late 1990s, 80% of the girls and women working in the sex trade came from outside Vancouver. Some had not had contact with their families for years. A survey of 183 sex trade workers conducted by the Prostitution Alternatives Counseling and Education (PACE) Society between 1999 and 2001 revealed that acts of violence against these women were frequent. They were subjected to robberies, beatings, kidnappings, and forced confinement. The survey showed a gulf between acts of violence suffered and acts of violence reported. The findings also indicated that the women had a profound distrust of police and other authorities. Pickton became familiar with the downtown east side through visits to a rendering plant located there, where he disposed of waste animal parts. He would cruise the 10-block strip called the Low Track, offer women money and rugs, and often take them back to his farm. In 1978, a joint RCMP Vancouver Police Department Missing Women Task Force began compiling a list of missing women. The earliest case on the list connected to Pickton was that of Diana Melnick, last seen on 22 December 1995. Pickton was not convicted of Melnick's murder. The most recent case on the list connected to Pickton, and one of the 6 murders for which he was convicted, was that of Mona Wilson, last seen in November 2001. Of the 26 disappearances officially attributed to Pickton, 1 occurred in 1995, 1 in 1996, 6 in 1997, 4 in 1998, 5 in 1999, 2 in 2000, and 7 in 2001. Other disappearances before and during this period were not officially connected to Pickton due to a lack of evidence. Because of the marginalized lifestyles and transient habits of the victims and other people in the downtown East Side, disappearances often went unnoticed. The disappearance of Sherry Rail, who vanished in 1984, was not reported for 3 years. In 1987, the RCMP set up a special team to investigate the unsolved murders and disappearances of sex trade workers. It was disbanded in 1989 due to limited progress. Over the years, as the rate of disappearances escalated, rumors of a serial killer began to circulate in the downtown East Side. Sex trade workers began walking the low track in groups and writing down the license plate numbers of cars that picked women up. But the disappearances continued. In 1991, the families of missing women, along with advocates for sex trade workers, established an annual Valentine's Day Remembrance Walk as a memorial to murdered and missing victims. They demanded a thorough investigation, but the police response was sluggish. The Vancouver police refused to say that a serial killer was at work, or even consider that the missing women were dead. There were no bodies to warrant an investigation that would be a strain on police resources. To police, it seemed reasonable to presume that some of the women had moved away, and others had died from drug overdoses. There were complaints of police apathy, particularly from the Vancouver Sun newspaper. It accused the police of giving low priority to crimes committed against sex trade workers. The Vancouver Police Department was also hampered by its reluctance to adopt newly emerging methods of investigation, such as psychological criminal profiling and geoprofiling. Many of the missing women were also Indigenous. As the Pickton case unfolded with its many Indigenous victims, it focused public attention on the wider issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. This in turn led to a national government inquiry into the issue, beginning in 2016. On 22 March 1997, a woman Pickton had taken to his farm fought back when he tried to handcuff her. She seized a kitchen knife, and in the ensuing struggle, both received serious stab wounds. The woman ran to the road and waved down a car whose occupants called an ambulance. She was taken to Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. While the woman was undergoing emergency surgery, Pickton was receiving treatment for his injuries in the same hospital. An orderly found a key in his pocket that fit the handcuffs on the woman's wrist. Pickton was arrested and charged with attempted murder, assault with a weapon, and forcible confinement. The charges were stayed and eventually dropped because the woman, whose name was placed under the protection of a publication ban by the courts, was not considered a competent witness due to drug addiction. Pickton claimed she was a hitchhiker who had attacked him. In the spring of 1999, an informant told the Vancouver police that a single mother and drug addict named Lynn Ellingson had seen a woman's body hanging in Pickton's slaughterhouse. When questioned by police, Ellingson initially denied the story. Only much later did she admit that on 20 March she had in fact seen the body. She did not report it because she feared Pickton and depended on him for money for drugs. Early in 1999, Bill Hiscox, who worked for the Picktons, informed the RCMP that Lisa Yelds, a close friend of Pickton, had told Hiscox she had seen women's clothing, purses and identification papers at the pig farm. Hiscox believed they were the property of the missing women. Police questioned Yelds, but she was uncooperative. It was the second time Hiscox had contacted police about his suspicions, but they could not obtain a search warrant based on hearsay evidence, verbal information reported by someone who was not directly a witness to it. They required an eyewitness report of criminal activity or the existence of physical evidence. In 2001, the Vancouver Police and the RCMP formed Project Evenhanded, a joint task force to investigate the missing women from the downtown east side. In early February 2002, Scott Chubb, formerly employed by the Pickton family as a truck driver, informed the RCMP in Port Coquitlam that he had personally seen illegal guns in Pickton's trailer home. That information met the official requirement for a search warrant. On 5 February, officers of the task force raided the pig farm. In addition to several illegal and unregistered guns, they found items connecting missing women to the property. Pickton was arrested on weapons charges and then released on bail. He was kept under surveillance and was not permitted to return to the pig farm, while police conducted a thorough search under a second warrant. Among the evidence they discovered were handcuffs, women's clothing and shoes, jewelry, and an asthma inhaler prescribed to Serena Abbotsway, one of the missing women. DNA testing of blood found in a motorhome on the property proved to be that of Mona Wilson. On 22 February 2002, Pickton was rearrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. A total of 26 murder charges were eventually laid against him. While Pickton was being held in jail in Surrey, British Columbia, he shared a cell with an undercover RCMP officer he believed to be another detainee. In their conversation, Pickton said he had murdered 49 women and had wanted to make it 50. Meanwhile, the pig farm became the largest crime scene in Canadian history. Investigators took 200,000 DNA samples and seized 600,000 exhibits. Archaeologists and forensic experts needed heavy equipment to sift through 383,000 cubic yards of soil in search of human remains. The cost of the investigation was estimated at nearly $70 million. Pickton's preliminary hearing, to decide if there was enough evidence for trial, lasted from January to July 2003. Due to the unprecedented volume and complexity of legal issues that had to be litigated, his trial on the first 6 charges did not begin until 22 January 2007 in New Westminster. On 9 December 2007, Pickton was found guilty by a jury on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Those convictions were upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2010. Although Pickton claimed to have murdered 49 women, he was only charged with the murders of 26 who could be identified with evidence found on the pig farm, plus one unidentified woman whose remains were also found, who was given the name Jane Doe. The Jane Doe charge was eventually dismissed by the court because of a lack of information about her identity and the time of her death. After Pickton was convicted of 6 charges in the initial trial, British Columbia Crown prosecutors kept open the possibility of trying Pickton on the other 20 charges at a later date. However, on 4 August 2010, prosecutors announced they would not proceed on the 20 charges. They said a second trial, even if further convictions were achieved, would not add anything to Pickton's punishment, which was already the maximum possible under the law. The decision angered some of the families of the 20 victims. Others said they were relieved at being spared the experience of another long and difficult trial. In 2016, an autobiographical book titled Pickton, in his own words, allegedly written by Pickton and smuggled out of prison, was published by Outskirts Press of Denver, Colorado. It was offered for sale on Amazon.com, but was withdrawn due to public outrage. In 2010, a provincial government inquiry was established to examine the Pickton case and how it was handled by authorities. In December 2012, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry issued its final report, titled Forsaken. The inquiry said blatant failures by police, including inept criminal investigative work, compounded by police and societal prejudice against sex trade workers and Indigenous women, had led to a tragedy of epic proportions. The inquiry issued 63 recommendations, including the creation of a Greater Vancouver Regional Police Force to allow for more effective, less fragmented police cooperation. It also called for adequate funding for emergency shelters for women in the sex trade and for compensation for children of the missing women. Following the report, the Vancouver Police Department implemented several policy and procedural changes to its missing persons investigations. The missing persons unit was made a regular part of the police department. Investigations are required to begin without delay. Family members are advised regularly and consulted before the release of information, and the case file is kept open until the missing person is located.